Why plant a church? Have you wondered that? Why should any church engage in the process of planting another church? It's a good question. It's a question to consider: what are the benefits of planting a new worshiping community? And so in this first session, we are going to explore the biblical basis for planting new churches, as well as Unity's kind of specific and unique position to go plant a church. But first, I want to look at reasons why not to plant a church. You know, what would be the wrong motivation to go and plant a church? First one, reason not to plant a church is because you're not happy with your current church. That's no reason to go plant another. Planting a church because you're disillusioned or dissatisfied with your current church is not a good motivation. That's kind of like just taking your ball and going home. I'm going to go start something new. Maybe you have been a part of a church where you have not really agreed with the decision. You're unhappy in the direction of that church's leadership. But new churches born out of dissatisfaction are not really set up for the long term in terms of health. Instead, new churches should be born out of a deep desire to share God's love with other people in the world. So that's the first motivation that we would not want to use. Second reason not to plant a church: to seek greater prestige or more of a reputation in your area. Prestige and reputation are very poor reasons to plant a new church. I mean, the desire to be known in a certain area, or to have another church campus, or to say, hey, look at us, we're growing, we're expanding. It's really not about that. Because planting a church is not about us. Planting a church is about the people we want to reach with that church. So those are some motivations that we really want to be aware of to make sure that they're not a part of what we do when we think about planting a church. But why should Christians engage in the process of church planting? Well, really, there's one reason, and one reason only. And it is because we are called by God to go and make more disciples. Yes, Jesus' last words to his disciples before he ascended into heaven in the Gospel of Matthew say, "Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you." Well, I personally believe that churches are the best vehicle we have available to make disciples. Yes, churches are uniquely equipped to fulfill Jesus' command to go and make more disciples. So within a good and healthy church, Christians are naturally then discipled. They are made into a disciple. Here's a couple of examples of how within a church that Christians become discipled. One, Christians are discipled in a faith community. You see, one of the big benefits of being a part of a church is that you become a part of a community of people. It's very hard to grow as a Christian in isolation. But in community, well, then we encourage one another. We inspire one another. And we even challenge one another from time to time. And so Christians need a community that can do those things for them, that then help them in that essential aspect of discipleship. Second, Christians are discipled through worship. Yes, as you sit in a church service, you're encouraged to lift your heart up to God in praise and worship through the songs and the hymns, the praise. You're encouraged to think deeply about the scriptures and about how you, in your life, relate to God through the exposition of the biblical scriptures. Through the worship service itself, Christians are discipled and transformed. So you see two ways already that church becomes a vehicle to disciple people through a faith community and through the expression of worship. And the third, though, is that Christians are discipled through service. Yes, a church with an active mission team allows Christians to get involved in a large number of outreach programs that then profoundly affect the world around them. Yes, the church can bring large groups of people together. And when you have a large group of people together, you're able to make a much larger impact on the world than you ever could as an individual. Churches, I believe, are the perfect tools for making disciples. And since Jesus has commanded us to go and make disciples, planting churches and using churches as that vehicle to make disciples seems to me to be a very appropriate response to Jesus' commands. I mean, if this is true, then when a church is doing well, if a church is seeing success in making disciples in its current context and community, then they should prayerfully consider expanding that disciple-making commitment. Now, I want you to notice that Jesus says that we are to make disciples of all nations. Now, that's going to be really hard by just staying in one place. You see, after his resurrection, Jesus tells these same disciples in the book of Acts, he says, "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." Now, the disciples were in Jerusalem when they heard these words of Jesus. And so, in that sense, it was like Jesus saying, I want you to make disciples in the area that you reside. For us, that would be like Jesus saying to us, I want you to make disciples in the Denver area, in your little part of Lake Norman where you reside. That's your Jerusalem. And we've done that. I mean, through the church, through Unity has done an absolutely fantastic job of making disciples in the Denver area. This is your Jerusalem. But the disciple-making command is not limited to the town in which you reside. No, the disciples were also to go and make more disciples in Judea and in Samaria. Well, if you can see on the map here, you see Jerusalem, and then Jerusalem is a part of Judea, but Judea expands quite a bit further than just the town or city center of Jerusalem. So this would be like Jesus saying, yes, I want you to make disciples in Denver, but I also want you to go make disciples throughout all of Lincoln County. Maybe that's your Judea, where you're expanding beyond just that place that you reside. It's like Jesus is saying, don't be limited to just kind of your close and physical proximity. Think bigger. And this does not happen by accident. You don't make disciples in the Judea of your life by accident. This happens by intention. Making disciples throughout Lincoln County, that might mean planting a church in a different part of Lincoln County. Now, you can see on the map that there's also Samaria. Now, Samaria was even further than Judea, but Samaria was also different in that it had a different culture, a different atmosphere, a different environment from Judea and Jerusalem. Think of the Samaritans in the Bible. The Samaritans often did not get along with the Jewish people. They didn't see the world the same way. They had quite the ugly history between these two people groups. Think of the story of the Good Samaritan and how that story is so shocking because the Samaritan is the hero of that story, something that would have caused all of the original people hearing that story to just sort of gasp. But making disciples and planting churches is not just for the easy-to-reach places or the natural-to-reach places, which begs the question, where is our Samaria? Where might it be a bit more challenging for Unity to go and make disciples? What doesn't come naturally to us? What sort of cultures or people groups may be more challenging for one reason or another for us to reach? And these are the very groups that we need to be intentional about reaching in order to make disciples. You see, our disciple-making command is not limited to Jerusalem or Judea or Samaria. It is all-encompassing. Jesus says it even goes to the ends of the earth. This is how big the scope of Jesus' vision is for the world. All are included, and none are left out. Well, we come back to that original question that we started this time with: why plant a church? What I hope you've seen so far is that we are called to make disciples first and foremost, and the church can serve as a vehicle to go and do that. And it's a vehicle not just here in Denver, but in Lincoln County and beyond. And if churches are some of the best and most effective ways of creating disciples, then we need to concentrate our time, our energy, and our resources on creating more successful churches. Now, I'm sure there are objections to this approach. Some that I thought of is you may be wondering, well, isn't Lincoln County pretty well covered with churches? Aren't we a pretty churched area already? Well, the North American Mission Board released a study based on census data that looked at church to population ratio. And here's what they found. In 1900, so 120 years ago, there were 28 churches for every 10,000 Americans. Okay, 28 churches for every 10,000 Americans. In 1950, so 50 years later, there were 17 churches for every 10,000 Americans. In 2000, so just 20 years ago, there were 12 churches for every 10,000 Americans. You see where the trend is going? And in 2011, the most recent data they had available, there were 11 churches for every 10,000 Americans. I'm sure if those trends hold true, there are even less today in 2021. So as the population of our country and around the world has skyrocketed, the amount of churches that are focused on making disciples have not kept pace with the population. There are less churches today than are needed to reach the growing population. Now, the evidence of this bears out in another research study. The Barna Group, they published a report that tracked the rise of churchlessness in America. This is a group of people who report no longer being affiliated with any sort of church or kind of system of religion. This is the churchless. This first graph I want to show you shows that in the 1990s, the unchurched in America was 30% of the population. In the 2000s, that rose to 33% of the population. And as you can see, in 2014, the unchurched within America, who self-identify as unchurched, grew to 43% of our country. Let's dive a little bit deeper into those numbers. So on the second graph, you can see that of the churched, of the people who say, yes, I attend church, 49% were actively engaged in church. And what they defined as active was meaning attending at least once per month. 8% were minimally churched, meaning that they attended infrequently and unpredictably. So of the unchurched, that 43% that say, no, we do not attend church, 33% were de-churched. That statistic is especially concerning to me because that's 33% of people who identified as attending church in the past, who used to go to church, who used to be a part of a faith community, but for some reason are now de-churched. They no longer identify as being a churched person. They are no longer within a faith community. And 10% of that unchurched, of that 43%, never attended church. So not only has church growth not kept pace with population growth in America, but the churches that do exist have become less effective at reaching the current population. I mean, to have 33% of the population once attend church and now no longer attend church, I mean, that's an indictment on the church in America as they have sought, or maybe not sought, to make disciples and fulfill that disciple-making command of Jesus. Well, that means that if a church is being successful in making disciples and fulfilling that command of Jesus, if they are being successful at that, God willing, then that church has a responsibility, I believe, to go and plant new churches that can create new disciples in areas that we currently are not reaching. Yes, those churches that are already making disciples, and I include Unity on that list, have a responsibility to engage with those 33% of people who are now de-churched, and those 10% of people who never considered themselves church. I mean, Jesus has a saying, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And isn't that true when you look at these statistics? The harvest is plentiful. 43% of our nation are not in a faith community right now. They're not being discipled. The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers, the churches that are being effective in making those new disciples are few. Well, friends, as you can see from these statistics, the need is great. I believe that we at Unity, we are to be the laborers, working on God's behalf to create new disciples. And I want to make it personal for a moment. I want you to think of a person you know, someone that, there's a face and a name to it, there's a history to it, there's a relationship with this person who does not attend church right now and maybe does not know God. I want you to think of a person and think, is that person de-churched? Did they used to attend church and now no longer? Or have they never really been a part of a church? It is out of love for that person that we seek to have that person become a disciple and discover the love that God has for them. It is that is our motivation in even considering going and planting a church. Because what if we could plant a church that would be especially appealing to that person that you have in mind? Yes, it is for that reason that Unity can be engaged in church planting. And so this is our first session as we seek to prepare this church for even wrapping their mind around the idea of going and planting another church. And I hope you see that the reason, the motivation behind planting a church is simply to continue that disciple-making process that Jesus has asked all of us to go and do. And how we can be most effective in that process is through a church that is actively discipling people, which Unity is. And then taking that model, taking that passion that God has gifted us with and bringing that to other places that also need churches that are making disciples. So next session, we will look a little bit deeper at the how, the practical behind planting a church. But for now, I want you just to reflect for yourself on this theology behind church planting, the why of why we do it.